Okay, so we're going to get started. Can you hear in the back? Yeah? Okay, great. So I'm Robin Wilson. I'm the director of the new Family Law and Policy program at the University of Illinois. We are delighted to have you here and to be co-sponsoring this event with the Epstein program in health law and policy directed by Professor David Hyman. I'm actually going to turn over things to the Dean of the Medical School, Dean Mariscalco, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. I am privileged that Dean Colombo asked me to introduce Dr. Offit. Dean Colombo would have been here, but he's in the middle of a very important meeting, so he sends his regrets. Paul Offit is pretty much a giant in the world of pediatrics and in the area of vaccinology because of the work that he's done with a very important vaccine for a common childhood diarrheal illness, which is not what he's going to talk about today. But it does explain why Paul's passion for vaccine development and how it changes healthcare, really for families and for children, explains where he comes from. Paul is the Maurice Hillman Professor of Vaccinology and a professor of pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. And if you've read his CV, he's a recipient of many awards and prizes for excellence, both from where he trained at the University of Maryland and also the Vaccine Development Award from the Infectious Disease Society of America and a Research Development Award from the NIH. These are all, as you can imagine, highly prestigious awards. So we're lucky to have him here. Paul's going to talk about his newest book called Bad Faith, and it's subtitled When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine. So I will turn this over to Paul, let you all know that he does have a book out front, though it's not this one that he's going to talk about. The one out front is Deadly Choices, How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All. So, but he's willing to stick around afterwards and sign a couple books no matter what you got. So thank you. Welcome. Thanks for coming. And we're honored to have you here.
Thank you. Right. So I wrote this book called Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine, because I lived through the 1991 Philadelphia measles epidemic. And now you're going to live through it. So it started on April 20th, 1989 at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, when after returning from a trip to Spain, a teenager with a blotchy rash attends an REM concert at the Spectrum. A couple weeks later, several other teenagers get sick. Measles virus has now entered our city. Now, on May 21st, 1990, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. You would assume from the somewhat comical title that measles is really no big deal. But it is a big deal. Measles vaccine was first introduced in the United States in 1963. Prior to that time, every year that virus caused between 3 and 4 million cases in the United States every year, about 48,000 hospitalizations, and 500 deaths. Almost everyone was infected by the time they were 15 years of age. When people died, and typically it was children who died, they died either of dehydration, encephalitis, or pneumonia. Encephalitis is inflammation of the brain. Now, the vaccine worked. By 1978, only 27,000 cases of measles were reported. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was optimistic that measles could be eliminated from the United States, so they launched the Measles Elimination Program with the goal to eliminate the virus by 1982. In 1983, only 1,500 cases were reported, but in the late 80s and early 1990s, measles virus came back. In Philadelphia was the single hardest hit city during that 1989 to 1991 epidemic. By November 29, 1990, 96 Philadelphia children had been infected with measles. By December 7th, that number increased to 124. By December 31st, that number increased to 258. And in December of 1990, an 18-month-old boy dies from measles pneumonia. That was the first measles death in our city in 20 years. On June 12th, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer as another child died. Both measles deaths occurred in unimmunized children. The Philadelphia Health Commissioner, who was Bob Ross, recommends that first dose of measles vaccine should be given at 6 months of age. And 7 weeks later, the city health officials do something that has never been done before and has never been done since. See, that's the teaser. That's to sort of make you stay for the rest of this talk. That is Dr. Ross. who was a good friend during that time. He's in California now. So on January 16, 1991, Bob receives an anonymous phone call from a woman whose daughter belongs to the Faith Tabernacle Church in North Philadelphia. The woman warns Ross that church members don't believe in medical care. Quote, "No one had died yet," said Ross, "but for the first time we were worried that we might not hear about a case of measles until a church member calls the police or calls the coroner to pick up the body." The Faith Tabernacle Church's doctrine instructs members to, quote, "believe that the Bible is opposed to all means of healing apart from God's way." Quote, "If I go to God and ask him to heal my body," says church member Gordon Korn, "I can't go to a doctor for medicine. You either trust God or you trust man." The church school contains hundreds of children, none of whom are immunized, and none of whom are about to receive medical care if they get sick. This is a picture of Faith Tabernacle. Actually, it's still alive and well in our city, still has hundreds of children in its church school. It's in, for those of you who know Philadelphia, it's in right at the north in Erie. It's or fifth in Erie. It's in North Philly. On February 11th, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as 2 more children die. On February 7th, Karen Still, a 9-year-old girl, is pronounced dead from measles. On February 10th, Monica Johnson, a classmate, is also pronounced dead. Monica is one of 11 children in the home, all of whom are unimmunized. Monica's father is a teacher at the school. Quote, "I feel very confident in my belief in the way I've raised my children," he says. "Monica is something that God has given us and now has taken away." After Karen Still's death, Ross meets with Reverend Charles Reinert, who was the pastor of Faith Tabernacle. Quote, "He was soft-spoken, the consummate gentleman," says Ross, "but he drove us nuts. We told him we needed to vaccinate everyone in the school, but he said the families wouldn't let us do it." On February 12th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as the legal community and the public health community take what is their first legal step. Ross obtains a court order to visit the families who refuse to let him touch their children. So he's allowed to look through the door to see whether or not they are having difficulty breathing, to see how their mental state was. Quote, "Most of the families had 6, 8, 12 kids because they didn't believe in birth control," says Ross. "There were also a lot of kids who were physically or mentally disabled because they all had in-house deliveries. Even if the kids were born breech, they didn't do a cesarean section. It was like the old days." Ross finds that the children appear well. Quote, "These kids had the rash, they were lying in bed, but they were alert, conversant, and appeared well hydrated," causing him to believe that those children then weren't suffering dehydration and weren't suffering measles virus pneumonia. He pleads with the parents to let him know if their children get any sicker. On February 15th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as another child dies. The day before, police were called to the home of Lynette Milnes, who's pronounced dead. Milnes doesn't attend the Faith Tabernacle Church, but her sister does. Lynette's 7 brothers and sisters are all unimmunized. Quote, "When another kid turned up at the morgue, I checked my list and realized she was on it," said Ross. "I had just called the mother, and she told me her kids were fine. She lied to me." It was at this point that Ross realized he couldn't trust the parents to tell him whether or not their children were getting sicker. So Ross refers the case to District Attorney Ron Castile, who considers filing criminal charges but demurs. Quote, "Unfortunately, when the parent is willing to risk the death of their children because of religious belief," says Castile, "it's unlikely that the threat of prosecution will in any way act as a deterrent." So now the courts take step 2 when Ross realizes the information he's getting from parents is inaccurate. He gets a court order to physically examine the children. He enlists residents at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, which are the 2 major children's hospitals in our city, to go door to door. Quote, "It was one of the more inspiring moments in my 30 years in healthcare," says Ross. "These are busy people on call every third night, yet they were happy to do it." On February 15th, this headline appears in the Daily News as 2 more children die. In the early morning of February 15th, Nancy Evans, a 5-year-old from North Central Philadelphia, dies from measles. Nancy, however, doesn't belong to the Faith Tabernacle Church. Rather, she belongs to the First Century Gospel Church, another faith healing group in our city. These 2 churches are still very active and still very big in the city of Philadelphia. Also on February 15th, Tina Louise Johnson, the 13-year-old sister of Monica Johnson, dies on the day of Monica's funeral. Neither Nancy Evans nor Tina Louise Johnson were taken to a doctor when their illnesses worsened. 5 children have now died in 10 days. Philadelphia is in the midst of the worst measles epidemic in the United States. In the U.S., typically at this time, about 1 in 1,000 infected children died from measles. In some developing world countries, that number can reach as high as 1 in 300. In Philadelphia, 4 of 150 children with measles who attend the Faith Tabernacle Church are dead. That is a rate of 1 in 35, worse than any developing world country. So, on February 15, 1991, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention sends a team to investigate. The question was the strain of measles virus that was circulating in the city of Philadelphia more virulent than strains that were circulating in the rest of the country, where the mortality rate was not nearly what it was in our city? Bill Atkinson, who headed that CDC team, finds that the measles deaths have nothing to do with the circulating strain and everything to do with the parents. Children are dying because they aren't getting intravenous fluids for severe dehydration or supportive therapy like oxygen for their pneumonia. On February 18th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as Charles Reinert, for the first time, the pastor of Faith Tabernacle Church, is willing to speak out. Up until this point, he'd remained silent. Quote, "The devil has tried to put fear in people's hearts," he says. "Job was robbed of everything he had. As he went through the trial, he learned from it. There is no fear when you can see God on your side." Reinert sees deaths in his church as a test of his faith, a test he has every intention of passing. "It's drawing us all together," he says. Now the Philadelphia courts take the third step, which is they obtain a court order to hospitalize children who are critically ill. With the telephone number of a judge in hand, residents from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and St. Christopher's Children's Hospital examined children from Faith Tabernacle Church. Quote, "It was like entering a time warp," said Mark Jaffe, who headed the St. Chris's team. "With the exception of the fact that they stay at home and watch their children die from measles, they seem like wonderful people." On February 18th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as now we've been able to successfully hospitalize children who we've identified as being stricken with measles and requiring hospitalization. The first child who was admitted was Daniel Kern, who was a 4-year-old who had measles pneumonia. The healthcare worker insisted on admitting the child to the hospital. The parents, quote, politely but firmly refused. Ross called the city solicitor, Sharice Lilly, who called family court judge Edward Summers, who gets an emergency order to hospitalize the child against the parents' will. A second child, a 1-year-old named Bianca Carpina, is also hospitalized against her parents' will. The Philadelphia measles epidemic is now at its peak. At CHOP, about 82 children were seen in the emergency department at this point. By the time this epidemic was over, we saw more than 200, and 28 have been hospitalized. Eventually, we hospitalized about 40. At St. Chris's, 250 children were seen in the emergency department, and 3 were being hospitalized every week. Ross and his team have visited 80 families and 500 children, but predicts correctly there will be more measles deaths in the city of Philadelphia. On February 21st, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Daily News. Philadelphia is now a feared destination. 2 nearby schools cancel trips to the city. The city prints 50,000 educational pamphlets and is vaccinating hundreds of school children every week. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania sends $100,000 in federal funds to help. On February 27, 1991, Mayor Wilson Goode asked the city solicitor's office to obtain a court order to forcibly vaccinate children, even if their parents don't want them to be vaccinated. Now, according to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, states are permitted to compel vaccination of their citizens. In the landmark case, and it's probably one with which you're all familiar, is the famous Jacobson v. Massachusetts case in 1905. There was an outbreak of smallpox in Cambridge. The Cambridge Board of Health required a smallpox vaccine or a $5 fine. Henning Jacobson, who was a Lutheran minister, chose neither. He wasn't going to vaccinate himself, nor was he going to pay the fine. He was a Lutheran minister. He believed that he would be protected by God and didn't have to worry about getting smallpox because his faithfulness would be rewarded. Writing for the majority was Justice John Marshall Harlan, who said the following, quote, "The liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States does not import an absolute right to be wholly freed from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. Society based on the rule that each one is a law unto himself would soon be confronted with anarchy and disorder." This case went to the United States Supreme Court. The case of whether or not a state could compel vaccination went to the Supreme Court one more time. It was 17 years later. It was the case of Rosalind Zucht, who was expelled from Brackenridge High School in San Antonio for refusing a smallpox vaccine. The difference between this case and the previous case was smallpox was not epidemic at the time that she was expelled. But in either case, the Supreme Court again unanimously granted states the broad authority to impose health regulations, in this case vaccination. There was another case, which interestingly wasn't a vaccine case. It was really a child labor law case, but the ruling did in part talk about vaccines. So I just want to mention this. This was the woman's name was Sarah Prince. She wanted to take her niece to distribute pamphlets on the streets of Brockton, Massachusetts, relatively late at night. That trumped child labor laws. And so she then took her case ultimately to the Supreme Court to try and see whether or not her religious belief, which was to be able to distribute pamphlets on behalf of Jehovah's Witnesses, trumped child labor laws. They didn't. This was in part the ruling which weighed in on vaccines, even though it really wasn't a vaccine case. Quote, a parent cannot claim freedom from compulsory vaccination for the child any more than for himself on religious grounds. The right to practice religion freely does not include the liberty to expose the community to infectious disease. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free, under identical circumstances, to make martyrs of their children. So although there is no constitutional right to, I should try to make it, there's a distinction between a mandatory vaccination and a compulsory vaccination. With a mandatory vaccination, you were asked to get a vaccine. If you choose not to get a vaccine, then you may pay some sort of societal price. You may have to pay a fine in the case of Henning Jacobson. You may not be able to go to school in the case of Rosalind Zuck. You may not be able to work in the hospital that you want to work at. That's mandatory vaccination. Compulsory vaccination is you are pinned down and vaccinated whether you want to be vaccinated or not. I mean, in the U.S. military has compulsory vaccination, but you don't have to join the military. In this case, it's a question of whether or not children could be forcibly vaccinated against their parents' will in Philadelphia in 1991. That was the issue for us. Now, although there's no constitutional right to refuse vaccines, states may allow exemptions. That's a state issue, and invariably it's a political one. So initially, there were a number of cases that went before state Supreme Courts to try and answer the question, can I choose not to vaccinate my child on the basis of religious grounds? And these cases all lost. They lost from the standpoint of the parent, because for the most part the ruling was you're not being discriminated on the basis of your religion, because all religions are being asked to be vaccinated. So these did not win from the parent standpoint. But that changed, actually. At least the thinking changed because of something that happened in the New York State Assembly in 1966. Once again showing that bad things come from New York. Okay, I don't know if I'm from Philadelphia, but you can take your pick. The Giants, the Mets, the Yankees, certainly. So in any case, in 1966, New York State was considering a bill in Albany requiring a polio vaccine for school entry. Now that bill passed by a vote of 150 to 2, but there were 2 dissenting votes because the bill excluded parents whose religion forbade vaccination. This was the direct result of the lobbying efforts of one particular religious group, and this is a religious group, frankly, that's where the major texts of that religion specifically stated that one shouldn't be vaccinated. And now this would have had to have been a religion that was founded after the first vaccine, right? The first vaccine was Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine in 1796. So this obviously isn't going to be based on anything written in the Old Testament. It was written well before 1796, as well as the New Testament, as well as the Quran. This would have to have been a more modern religion that was lobbying for this. And the name of that religion was Christian Science. That is correct. Christian Science. See, everybody usually says Scientology, which I have no idea why that's a religion other than they got the federal government to call it that, but in any case. So in any case, that's right, Christian Science, which was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in 1875 with her book, Science and Health with the Key to the Scriptures. Mary Baker Eddy believed that illness was a spiritual, not physical disorder, that diseases should be treated with prayer, not medicines or surgeries. Quote, as she says in Science and Health, we have smallpox because others have it, but mortal mind, not matter, contains and carries the infection. It was, diseases didn't exist. So if you had a boil, for example, you were perceiving yourself to have a boil, but you didn't really have a boil because God was perfect. God made man in his image, and therefore man was perfect. And so if you had a boil, you didn't really have it. The problem was you weren't close enough to God, so you had to pray to get closer to God. And as you prayed and prayed and prayed, and your boil disappeared, it's because you prayed. And I mean, to her credit, this was, frankly, in the late 1800s, one of the fastest growing religions because medicine didn't have much to offer in 1875. I mean, there was a smallpox vaccine, there was quinine to treat malaria, there was ether and chloroform as general anesthetics, but that was about it. I mean, you had cathartics, you had leeches, you had corrosives, you had emetics. You know, the old line was that, you know, that doctors, old doctors let you die and new doctors gave you things that killed you. That was it. So, I mean, what she did, I think she put into the hands of the common man the ability to heal by prayer. And that's, I think, what made it so attractive. So in any case, in 1972, there was a key case, Mayer versus Besser, where William Mayer took advantage of that New York State decision, successfully claiming that his First Amendment rights were being violated, that he was being discriminated against because he wasn't a Christian Scientist. And as a consequence, you know, a number of states then have religious exemptions. Actually, the current number is 47 states. It's certainly Mississippi doesn't have one, West Virginia doesn't have one, and arguably California doesn't have one. So in any case, Pennsylvania had a religious exemption to vaccination. At the time that this outbreak occurred in 1991, Pennsylvania had a religious exemption to vaccination that had been on the books for about 10 years. So when Charles Reinert, who was the pastor of the Faith Tabernacle Church, said, "My religion, I have a religious claim to not vaccinate," he was right. In either case, the city sought a court order to forcibly vaccinate children, despite the fact that that religious exemption existed. Now, what Reinert did was he went to the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union to represent him. And certainly the ACLU had a history of representing unpopular causes. And believe me, in 1991, representing Faith Tabernacle was an unpopular cause. So for example, the ACLU, local chapter of the ACLU represented the Dove World Outreach Center when they wanted to be able to wear this shirt, "Islam is of the devil," to school, schools that contained Muslims who were obviously offended by the hateful shirts. They represented the Westboro Baptist Church. This is a church that, as you know, you probably know the story well, that believes that homosexuality is a sin, that Americans are being punished for the sin of homosexuality by having American soldiers die in the war. They would often protest or bring these signs, "Thank God for dead soldiers," to funerals of American soldiers, and this girl's wearing their website, which is www.godhatesfags.com. And probably most famously, and this preceded the events in 1991 in our city, the ACLU was willing to represent a neo-Nazi's interest in marching down the streets of Skokie, Illinois. So that's actually not that far from here, is it? So a suburb of Chicago that in 1977 was home not only to a number of Jews, but also to a number of Holocaust survivors. Still, on March 2nd, 1991, this headline appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer as the ACLU declined to help these parents. Now, you probably look back on that and think, that's not possible. But they did, and the reason is you had to be there. I mean, we were in a panic in our city. I mean, you know, were pulling child after child dead from their home, and people were very, very scared that they were going to catch measles and potentially suffer the consequences. There is certainly a free exercise of religion claimed by the parents, said Deborah Levy of the Philadelphia chapter of the ACLU, but there is also a competing claim that parents don't have the right to martyr their children, thus echoing the words of that 1944 Prince v. Massachusetts case. I don't think we've walked away from our principles here. And so on March 2nd, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer: "Judge permits city to vaccinate objectors." And Jerome Bolter actually was the lawyer representing the parents of Faith Tabernacle. He protested that decision, quote, "Their healing is dependent on their faith," he says. "They believe that's the right thing to do for their children. The judge rules in favor of the city," so Bolter takes the case to the Pennsylvania Superior Court of Appeals, where the state Superior Court judge was Vincent Cirillo. During the time he was hearing the appeal, Sean Lacey was the public defender representing the children. So the children had an advocate, as did the parents of Faith Tabernacle. Cirillo, during the trial, notices a pained expression on Lacey's face. "Are you ill?" he asks. Lacey had just been handed a note concerning a 20-month-old boy, James Jones, whose parents were members of Faith Tabernacle, a child who had died of measles encephalitis, which really set the tone for that hearing. And Bolter argues now that the parents are willing to allow sick children to be admitted to the hospital, but he still doesn't want to be vaccinated, thus implying that treatment is as good as prevention, a statement clearly contradicted by events of the previous month. So on March 9, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Daily News as children now are vaccinated against their parents' will. On June 7th, this headline appears as the measles epidemic slows. Typically, measles is a disease of the late winter and early spring, says Robert Levinson, Director of Disease Control. When the warm weather comes, the cases disappear. Charles Reinert, pastor of the Faith Tabernacle Churches, interprets those events differently. He focusing on the children in his church who had either survived the infection without medical care, who had survived the infection without medical care. He says, quote, "We believe God has provided his faithfulness." On December 3rd, 1992, Bill Atkinson and co-workers from the CDC report their findings from this outbreak. Among church members, 486 people were infected and 6 died. As the virus then spread from the epicenter of those 2 churches into the surrounding community, among non-church members, 938 people were infected and 3 died. All 9 deaths were in children. The attack rate in church members was about 1,000-fold greater than in the surrounding community. In 2013, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention identifies about 30,000 children whose parents have chosen not to vaccinate them for religious reasons. Given the underreporting and the insular nature of some faith healing groups, that number is likely much larger. Now, I'm going to regret this slide, but what the hell? It's my talk, right? I can do what I want. I think that when you write a book like this book, Bad Faith, I think, and I describe not just sort of what you just heard is a chapter in this book, but I talk a lot about faith healing in this book, and I spent a lot of time talking to parents who believed in faith healing. And in addition to that, and there's about 20 or so sects in the United States that believe in faith healing. We have 2 big ones in our city. Christian Science is probably still the largest, but I also talk about a number of other things, which is sort of Jehovah's Witnesses who are not faith healers, but who believe that their children shouldn't get life-saving blood transfusions, and this unusual circumcision ritual that is prominent in the Northeast, which puts children at risk for invasive herpes simplex virus infection. So I think I'm allowed to talk about why parents do that, because I talk to a lot of these parents, and I think I'm allowed to talk about how the law has come to allow it to happen, because we do allow this to happen. What I think I'm probably not allowed to talk about is how one defines religion. But what the hell? So I did. So I think what struck me when these parents came to our house was they all said the same thing. Jesus was my doctor. So for this book, I actually read through the New Testament, and I come to the following conclusions. Now, I'm not a religious person. I think that understates it. And so it would have been very easy for me to take that sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, that sort of militant atheists, that religion is illogical and potentially harmful. But I actually didn't come to that conclusion as I read through the New Testament. I think here's sort of how I put this together. Independent of whether you believe in the existence of a supreme being, or independent of whether or not you believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or that the Gospels, which were written, decades after he died, are in any way an accurate reflection of what he did or said, you have to be impressed with the figure described in those 4 Gospels as Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, because at the time that he lived, and Mark, which was the first Gospel written, probably about 30 years after he died, at that time, child abuse was the crying vice of the Roman Empire. I mean, abandonment was common, infanticide was common, children were property. The Hippocrates, who lived about 400 years before Jesus, and talked endlessly about how one can reasonably interact with parents, the ethics of interacting with your patients, never mentions children, because children didn't matter. They were treated no differently than slaves. That is not the way that Jesus of Nazareth is described in the New Testament. The way he's described is as someone who cared about children. He believed that they were human, they had souls, therefore they could go to heaven. Suffer me the children, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. But I think the sort of the most impressive quote, at least for me as I read through the New Testament, was was Matthew 25:40. Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of my brethren, you have done it unto me. I think you could take that phrase and emblazon it on the entranceway of every children's hospital in the world. And so, if you look at Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor of Rome, in 315, he was the first to pass a law protecting children against abuse. 6 years later, he was the first to pass a law that protecting them from poverty, which really formed the basis of Christian relief societies for the next 1,800 years. I mean, early monasteries had both inpatient and outpatient facilities that formed a prototype, frankly, for modern-day hospitals. You had people like Edward Bliss in China or Albert Schweitzer in Africa who brought modern medicine to the four corners of the earth. I don't get it. I don't get how it is that they came to say that. It doesn't make sense to me. And what really upset me, frankly, during this, living through this, and I was one of those doctors that went from house to house to do this. I was a younger physician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia at the time. I just wondered, where the hell was the church? I mean, why didn't they stand up and say, this isn't us? These aren't Christian things to do. And it would have really helped. But, it sort of reminds me of there's a quote from W.H. Auden's The Shield of Achilles, which is, when all the mass and majesty of the world, when all that carries weight and always weighed the same lay in the hands of others, they were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. And that's what I felt like here. At the time, Anthony Bevilacqua had been promoted from bishop to cardinal. He was an important voice in our city, and he could have really helped us out because we were scrambling for this, but we didn't get that help. So in any case, I actually wrote an op-ed about this. It was published in the New York Times on February 12th that they titled, What Would Jesus Do About Measles? I would never have the hubris to write that, but that's what the New York Times titled it. And it meant that I got a lot of emails from college friends who said to me, since when do you quote scripture? It was a fair criticism, but right. So in any case, I'm going to have plenty of time for your questions, because I'll stop here. So my question to you, and this is the point of view. So now you don't have to buy the book. I'm going to tell you exactly what the point of view of the book is. The point of view of the book is that in this country, well, I'll take a step back. It's hard. You can't really do this in Canada, and you can't really do this in England, but you can do it here. You didn't used to be able to do it here. We did not have, well, you in the past, in the early 1900s, first part of the 20th century, if you chose to medically neglect your child, you often would, in the name of religion, you would go to, your children would be put in foster care and you would go to jail. That changed in the early 1970s. And the reason it changed, ironically, is because of something called Hubert Humphrey's Child Abuse Protection and Treatment Act, or CAPTA, right? This was, as we became more and more aware of child abuse in this country, the federal government decided to provide funds to prevent, recognize, and treat it. It was passed by Nixon's administration. The problem is there were two prominent Christian scientists in Nixon's administration that realized there was an uncomfortable light that was about to be shown on their religion, because Christian scientists, frankly, practice medical neglect. I mean, they pray instead of giving insulin for diabetes. They pray instead of giving antibiotics for meningitis. And so they said, you cannot receive any federal funds unless you have on your state's books a law that states that you have a religious exemption to child abuse and neglect laws. And that's what it's called, a religious exemption to child abuse and neglect law, which I would argue is on its face a contradiction in terms. Those two Christian scientists later, a few months after they put that in, later went to jail for their role in the Watergate scandal. One was Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman. The other was his chief domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman. So we have those laws on the books. Now, 6 states have subsequently overturned those laws, so that there's no religious exemption to child abuse and neglect laws. Other states have sort of various forms of that. And the person who's been behind, who's sort of the unlikely hero in this book, is a woman named Rita Swan. She's my hero in this book. She begins the book, she ends the book. She's the one who fights this, and she's an unlikely hero because she's a child of Christian scientists. She was a Christian scientist, and when her 15-month-old son Matthew had bacterial meningitis, she prayed for the 12 days it took for him to die. And then after he died, she sort of had an epiphany, and she said, "I've been duped. I need to learn about this." And what's interesting to me about Rita is she's brilliant. I spent a lot of time with her on the phone, and probably 15 hours on the phone. And she's a woman who got a PhD in English from Vanderbilt. She wrote her thesis on Percy Shelley and British Romantic poetry. Her husband, also a Christian Scientist, got his PhD in mathematics from Vanderbilt. And she said to me that when asked the question, how basically could you let this happen, she said what many faith healers say, I was treating him. I was treating him by prayer. But she said, you don't realize how little I knew about medicine. I didn't know what a thermometer was, frankly. I didn't know that a fever meant infection, even. So just because I was an expert in British Romantic poetry and my husband an expert in differential equations doesn't mean I know anything about this. And so she chose to educate herself. So she did something no faith healer does. She said, I let this happen. I did this. It wasn't the usual, it was God's will. It wasn't that passive position. It was, I did this. And so she went on the Phil Donahue show, which was a very popular show at the time, and basically declared a major religion as a fraud, or in her words, a fragile magic. She chose to educate herself about medicine, and 5 years after her son died, she founded a group called Children's Healthcare as a Legal Duty, or CHILD, and she then relentlessly goes from state to state. She is the biggest pain in the ass for Christian Scientists out there. And she goes state to state to try and overturn those laws, to try and put spades of dirt into a hole that will never be filled, and that is that she let her son die. And she says that. I mean, that there is no peace for me. There is no angle of repose. I will just have to do this for the rest of my life. And so all my royalties from the sale of this book go to her organization, including the advance on my royalties. So, because she is just so brave to me. So, you know, I'm going to read. Can I read one section of the book? What the hell, if I can find it? There's just one thing. I'll read this. Okay, here it is. This will take about a minute. An analogy to Rita Swan's story can be found in M. Night Shyamalan's 2004 movie, The Village, the story of an insular community united by fear, brought together by the murder of loved ones. Several Philadelphians decide to create a 19th century farming community in rural Pennsylvania. Solace, they believe, can be found in retreating into the past. To isolate the community from a world they fear, the elders create mythical monsters that are supposedly hiding in the woods, referred to as the things of which we do not speak. The monsters won't bother the villagers as long as the villagers don't enter the woods. As a consequence, no one enters or leaves the village. Then something happens that the elders hadn't anticipated. A young man is stabbed. When an infection develops, the only way to save him is with antibiotics. Unfortunately, the community has been created to mimic the late 1800s, the time before antibiotics. Knowing the monsters are a hoax, the elders allow one of the residents, a young woman, to travel through the woods and get the antibiotics they need. They pick her because she's blind, hoping that when she returns, she won't have realized the wealth of life-saving technologies on the other side. Religions that ask their followers to act against love, compassion, and reason use a similar tactic. Rita Swan was afraid to oppose her church and see a doctor because her church believed that doctors want, quote, to dethrone God and are therefore evil. If she had sought out modern medicine, she would have been forced to confront that evil and, worse, the anger of God. But Rita Swan wasn't blind. When she crossed the woods and entered Wayne State University Medical Library and understood how she could have treated her son's illness, there was no going back, even if it meant ostracism from a community she had known all her life, even if it meant challenging her notion of God. Swan's break with her church came when she realized that no God would ask a parent to let a child die in his name. Quote, I believe that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, said Swan. That's what Jesus says. So I think religion has to work. It has to bless people. And if it doesn't, if it causes pain, if it justifies cruelty, then it's something I don't want any part of. I think we have to be explicit in rejecting things that are cruel and unjust, whether they're religious or not. Religion has to serve the good of humanity, not the other way around. So I'll stop there and take your questions.